trouble the president.
So sorry. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I know that I've made my point to you and to the Honorable Senate as it relates to the nexus between this question of proliferation of financing and what I would like to appeal to the Honorable Attorney General to look into that whole question about the biological and toxin weapon convention, and particularly those laboratories in our country that are unlicensed and that are not credited, or credited rather. Madam President, the amendments that we have before us that deals with the Financial Institution Act as well as the Securities Act and of course the Insurance Act, you'll realize that they are almost a replication of all three sets are similar in nature, and they all seek to achieve the same objective at the end of the exercise. We want to make the legislation is seeking to ensure that these very important financial institutions have a responsibility of ensuring that those actors in the marketplace, whether they be under the Financial Institutions Act, whether they come under the Insurance Act or the Securities Act, that they are not in any way using the facilities of state in order to promote and to engage in what is called proliferation financing. Madam President, the question that I would like to raise as it relates to their new responsibility, what is called Economic Sanctions Act or orders. And as you know, Madam President, these economic sanctions orders coming under the Economic Sanction Act, along with the accompanying regulations, are directed at this time at two main parties. We are talking about the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, what is known as North Korea, and the second one is the Islamic Republic of Iran. So the whole objective of the measures before us this evening is to ensure that whether it is terrorism, whether it is financing in terms of proliferation financing, weapons, stockpiling of same, be it nuclear, chemical, or biological, do not find their way or are delivered in any way or related sense in terms of materials, technology, dual-use goods to these parties involved. But most importantly, under the UN Security Council resolution, one of the obligations of member states like ours is to ensure that these weapons that we are referring to do not ever end up in the hands of non-state actors. I think that is very important, Madam President. Now, the institutions that have been addressed in the legislation, Madam President, which are the three that I've mentioned, what we need to clarify this evening would be the kind of mechanisms, the kind of monitoring mechanisms that will be put in place to ensure, Madam President, that there are no cracks created so that, for instance, what we are trying to avoid would in fact would not happen or would not take place. Madam President, we know some of these institutions as we speak today. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which falls under the Securities Act. We know that they have a lot of critical responsibilities to carry out under the Act. But we also know, Madam President, that there have been a lot of activities taking place in Trinidad and Tobago, on the stock exchange, in that arena, that leave a lot of room for concern. And that is why I would like to ask the Attorney General whether a special monitoring mechanism, we know the central bank will deal with the institutions that fall under the Financial Institutions Act, and they will be monitoring what is going on at the commercial banks, Madam President, and also non-bank institutions that may be falling under their direct control. We know that the Insurance Act will ensure that all insurance companies would fall under that particular institution as well. And they would have to issue the necessary guidelines and regulations to ensure, Madam President, that these institutions do not run afoul of what we are dealing with when it becomes law. Madam President, we would also like to know and get from the Attorney General our regulations and when regulations and guidelines will be effected to give, Madam President, some kind of guidance, some kind of direction to those institutions that would fall under this piece of legislation that we are dealing with, the Economic Sanctions Act and the orders accompanying that particular piece of legislation. That is very important for us to appreciate and for us to ensure materialize. Madam President, the Attorney General also in his contribution made reference to the United National Congress and particularly the government when it was in office between 2010 and 2015, and made a statement that the government or the party in government at that time was engaged in what is called politics. In fact, he said the government at that time was playing politics with this whole question of CFATF and all the recommendations that we had to address, and therefore not bringing laws to the Parliament to effect same. Madam President, I want to tell you that when the United National Congress was in office, I recall distinctly, Madam President, that the former Prime Minister, who will become the next Prime Minister shortly, Madam President, I distinctly recall, Madam President, that that particular Prime Minister stood up in defense of anti-terrorism activities, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but throughout the world, Madam President. And no other person than the distinguished former President of the United States piloted and promoted a special United Nations Security Council resolution.
I have to caution you that that is not relevant to the bill. I really have been giving you some latitude, but in your last few minutes, you need to be a little more specific to the bill, okay?
But Madam President, I have the right, and you'll guide me on this, if the Attorney General makes a statement that is very injurious to the opposition, isn't the opposition entitled to respond to the Attorney General? So whilst we may not be, Madam President, referring directly as he, no, I'm not challenging the President. I'm just saying, Madam President, that I'm seeking your guidance, because the Attorney General did make a statement, and I am simply responding to clear the air on the statement that was made by him. So I'm not doing anything to run afoul of relevancy 46.1. I'm not dealing with that. I just felt, Madam President, that I owe it to this Parliament and to your good self and to this country to at least set the record straight that it is unfair for the Attorney General to have accused the then government of only playing politics when it came to the recommendations, the 40 recommendations, and the 11 outcomes as it relates to FATF, what we are dealing with, Madam President. And what are we dealing with, Madam President? We are dealing, Madam President, with money laundering still. We are dealing with anti-terrorism. We are dealing with proliferation financing. And within that context, we are looking at the measures of economic sanctions, the orders, and the regulation. These are the matters that we are dealing with. But the Attorney General, Madam President, took the opportunity to swipe at the UNC, as he's entitled to. He's entitled to take a swipe at us. But I am, on behalf of the opposition, also entitled to rebut the statement made by him. So I'm saying, Madam President, it is wrong for the Attorney General to tell us and to tell you and this Honourable Senate that the UNC was only engaged in politics when it came to this matter of FATF and CFATF.
Senator Mark, you have 5 more minutes. And having elaborated on that point, I would ask you now, in your 5 minutes, to just bring together your points on the bill at hand.
Madam President, you will understand that we are at a grave disadvantage today, and you of all persons supposed to help us. Because they only give us a few hours, Madam President, to deal with this measure. And as you know, I am a person who will always fight in defense of the people's rights, although they didn't want us to talk today. But we had to do our work, and we are doing our work as best as we can. But I'm being guided by you, of course, and I respect you. Madam President, may I say that when we pull all of the strands together, what we can say is simply this. The Attorney General and the government have spent almost 4 years dealing with these matters, and they have always come at the last 11th hour to get our support for these measures as they are doing today. What we are saying, Madam President, is this. We will always do what we have to do in support of measures to take Trinidad and Tobago off the grey list. We are committed to taking Trinidad and Tobago off the grey list. And the Attorney General, I'm sure he got advanced knowledge that when he goes to Orlando next Sunday, as he told us, he is going to report back to us in the next couple of days when he returns that our rating would have gone up and we would be in a better place. I'm sure we will no longer be in the gray zone. We will be coming out, Madam President, I believe, from what the AG is telling us, in a positive light. And that is why he's saying that he knows what is going to happen, but he cannot reveal it. So I am hoping, Madam President, that whatever opposition, whatever concerns that we would have expressed as it relates to the legislation governing FATF and CFATF, it was always, Madam President, in the interest of the people of our country. And in that context, the measures that we have here today, dealing with the Insurance Act, dealing with the Securities Act, as well as the Financial Institutions Act. We know that they are all designed, Madam President, to strengthen our presence on the world stage and to ensure that at some rate or the other, Trinidad and Tobago will in fact be able, in the not too distant future, to find itself out of that zone, as I call it, the gray zone. With those few words, Madam President, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words on this very important matter. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Senator Vieira.
Thank you, Madam President. I think before I begin the substantive contribution, it might be useful to just highlight two things. First, the definition of proliferation financing. This means the act of providing funds or financial services which are used in whole or in part for the manufacture, acquisition, possession, development, export, transshipment, brokering, transport, transfer, stockpiling, or use of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, and their means of delivery and related materials, including both technologies and dual-use goods used for non-legitimate purposes in contravention of any written law or, where applicable, international obligations. It also is important to understand that we are talking about economic sanctions. And economic sanctions are commercial and financial penalties which are applied by one or more countries against a state. And as we know, they may include tariffs. We hear a lot about tariffs these days. Barriers, restrictions on financial transactions. In international affairs today, economic sanctions are now the tool of choice rather than warfare and other means of moving forward. And there's a whole talk now about smart sanctions, but that's a different topic. Anyway, the purpose of this legislation is to comply with our international obligations. And in particular, the United Nations Security Council's imposition on member states to implement United Nations sanctions, to exercise continued vigilance over businesses potentially connected with prohibited activities, and especially to implement proliferation controls that would prevent non-state actions from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. Now, to appreciate the significance of this legislation, it might perhaps be helpful to put things into perspective. Under treaty law, there are essentially two different traditions and approaches, monism and dualism. And in states with a monist system, a treaty automatically becomes law. It doesn't need to be translated or incorporated into the national law. So in those states, treaties are self-executing, and it will allow national courts to apply and adjudicate on them without further ado, once they have been ratified. That's not us. We subscribe to the dualist tradition. And under the dualist approach, no special status is afforded to treaties. So in other words, even though we sign all of these international treaties and conventions, they do not apply domestically in our law. The rights and obligations created by treaties have no effect in our domestic courts unless special legislation is brought giving effect to those treaties in the national law. So even though we are a member of the United Nations and are obliged to comply with the United Nations Security Council's injunctions, and we are obliged to implement proliferation controls, first we have to translate the applicable provisions into our national legislation before they can be properly operationalized. and applied in our national courts. Now, that raises a whole host of broader questions about treaties which we negotiate and don't sign, about treaties which we sign but don't ratify, and about treaties which we ratify and do not properly or fully operationalize into our domestic law. Today, we live in an interconnected world, and treaties are fundamental. But as someone with an international relations background, I have to say we do not pay sufficient attention to the treaty-making process, and the whole treaty system is weak in many respects. For example, our treaties are not scrutinized or debated in Parliament. Under the Economic Sanctions Act, at Section 11, there is established for the purposes of this Act a joint select committee of Parliament to be known as the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Economic Sanctions. I don't know if that exists. So there's a disconnect. Be that as it may, what this bill seeks to do is to fill gaps in the legal and regulatory framework for implementing proliferation financing controls. This legislation recognizes the need for government, public authorities, and the private sector to work together. Working together means sharing information and coordinating in an integrated way when dealing with anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. This legislation recognizes the need to recruit, to empower, and to accommodate our financial institutions, in particular the central bank, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the insurance sector, into, for want of a better expression, into a public-private partnership with appropriate proliferation financing controls. It recognizes that many financial institutions may not be well attuned to proliferation trends. As mentioned by both the Honorable Attorney General and Senator Mark, proliferation financing is targeted at halting the financing, that is, providing funds or financial services of weapons, and especially weapons of mass destruction. This legislation will empower the central bank, the SEC, to issue guidance to assist and raise awareness among our financial institutions about the risks of proliferation financing, and it will assist them in complying with our international obligations. A fairly significant proportion of proliferation activities use trade finance as a vehicle. And so special attention needs to be had for our finance and trade and insurance institutions, for example, when it comes to the giving of loans and extending credit facilities, to factoring, that is the purchase or discounting of a foreign account receivable for cash at a discount at face value, when it comes to giving guarantees and for providing insurance. So this legislation is necessary because without it, we run the risk of being seen as a country with weak financial safeguards. And I don't want to minimize or depreciate what Senator Mark has been saying about the weapons of mass destruction. I recognize Senator Mark as someone with a very deep understanding and knowledge of that area. And I know we tend to blow it off and think, oh, that doesn't apply to us in Trinidad and Tobago, but no, not so. And weapons of mass destruction are not just about bombs and radiation and nuclear warfare. It can also pertain to everyday ordinary objects like a laptop, coffee, that can be adapted or used towards the making of weapons of mass destruction. So one has to be sensitive, and we have to train and guide our financial institutions to be able to discern, how certain things may be taking place, whether it's in one of these laboratories that Senator Mark spoke about or elsewhere, that can be implicated or involved in terrorist activities. So the bottom line, the UN Charter imposes obligations on all its member states to implement the UN sanctions. The UN Security Council imposes a broad requirement on countries to exercise vigilance over businesses potentially concerned with prohibited activities. Many financial institutions, we recognize, are challenged when faced with implementing country-specific sanctions. And so for the powers that be to properly go forward in meeting our international obligations, we need to operationalize the domestic legislation, and so that there's a proper legal framework for our institutions to be able to take the necessary and appropriate actions. And so that is my understanding of the purpose of this legislation, and with that, I thank you.
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Madam President, thank you very much for the opportunity to join this debate. And Madam President, I'm full of energy and very motivated after listening to Senator Mark. I think the AG should be happy. Senator Mark is excited about ensuring that Trinidad and Tobago complies with all the FATF requirements and so on, and he's ready to go. Because, Madam President, once again, the opposition really has me perplexed, because there is this anxiety to reflect upon September 2015 to now and question the urgency and the work program of the government. But I'll just refresh the opposition's memory. In 2016, 2017, we dealt with, in that time from 15 to 19, we've been here long, a lot of hours. But we had the anti-terrorism amendment bill, the gambling bill, I'm sure you all are familiar with that, and the Insurance Act, the bill, the 2016 bill, which we eventually passed in 2018 with your support, and we thank you for that. In 2017, 2018, anti-terrorism, gambling, still with us, insurance, and Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority. And I'm sure that you know the TTRA is an important component in our international obligations compliance, particularly with FATF. And we look forward to your support on that. 2018, 2019 has been particularly busy. Civil asset recovery, I'm sure you're familiar with that. An important part of what the FATF wants of us. The Companies Amendment Bill to treat with the issue of beneficial ownership. Gambling Control Bill, it's still with us. Miscellaneous Provision Bill to deal with poker and anti-terrorism financing. Registration of deeds laid in the House to comply, again, with obligations relating to the opportunity to trace property, to deal with fraud, to deal with the opportunities that are now available, but with this legislation will no longer be available, to use land transactions, to move assets, to hide funds. And finally, the non-profit organization legislation. Now, the NPO is a very interesting story in relation to this bill and in relation to what Senator Mark has to say, because the NPO has a very interesting record in relation to the FATF. You see, Madam President, my friends may have forgotten, but in October 29, 2010, a few months after they came into government, we had the third follow-up report on the third mutual evaluation report. And among the many things in that report was the NPO. And the record in that report in relation to the NPO is that there are no requirements in legislation, regulations, or other enforceable means to comply with this recommendation. So it was not there in 2010. Fourth follow-up report, May 2011. Not there again. Fifth, October 27, 2011. No compliance with the requirements for NPO, the same paragraph. Sixth, May 12, 2012. Nothing on NPO. Seventh report, follow-up report, November 2012. Nothing on NPO. Eighth follow-up report, May 30, 2013. Nothing on NPO. Ninth, November 22nd, 2013. Absolutely nothing on NPO. 10th follow-up report, May 29, 2014. Still nothing on NPOs. 11th follow-up report, November 2017, 2014. Nothing on NPOs. In fact, by the time we got to November 2017, 2014, Trinidad and Tobago had been non-compliant on 12 of the core or key recommendations. In the October 2010, we had been non-compliant on 11 out of the 16. And 4 years later, we were non-compliant on 12 out of the 2016. And I've just used NPOs as one example, because if you're so anxious to meet the FATF and you want to work hard and you want to deal with this, 2010 to 2014, you had the third report, the fourth report, the fifth report, the sixth report, the seventh report, the eighth report, right up to the 11th report. So, Madam President, I don't think that the opposition is being sincere, or at least not Senator Mark. I don't think sincere in the criticism of the government and sincere in dealing in the opposition's own track record in relation to the compliance with FATF. In fact, Senator Mark says, we have a practice of coming to the Parliament at the last minute. And my response to that is that you have a practice of not coming to the Parliament at all. Even when we brought the NPO, to correct your tardiness from 2010 to 2014, we had to drag you kicking and screaming to support us in that legislation. Senator Mark talks about credit unions. Recommendation 29. Well, recommendation 29 has been there. You had your 5 years to comply with it. You did absolutely nothing about it. So, Madam President, this is not complex legislation. Over a period of time, and I will get to that, over a period of time, Trinidad and Tobago has in fact been able to move from the first mutual evaluation in April 1995, the report, through to the fourth. We've been able to move towards the sort of compliance we should have. And what we're doing tonight, I want to use the word retrofitting. We are simply retrofitting existing legislation. This is not a case where we have to pass a brand new piece of legislation to meet the requirements of CFATF or FATF. This is a case where we are asked to retrofit 3 pieces of legislation. And if anybody is finding it difficult to make 40 minutes or avoid tedious repetition, it is because that there isn't a lot in this bill. What this bill seeks to do is, one, and you could extend your time by talking about it 3 times we using the same definition. This bill is retrofitting the Financial Institutions Act, the Securities Act, and the Insurance Act by inserting in those 3 pieces of legislation a definition of proliferation financing. And you could extend your time by reading it out. I would not do that because Madam President will not allow me to do that. So that is the first thing we're doing. Because we now have to ensure that the existing legislation addresses proliferation financing, we have to insert a definition in there. And I don't think anybody could argue that. And I must say, Madam President, when you go through from 1995 straight up to the fourth round report. It is only between 2014 and now we see the requirement for anything relating to proliferation financing. So it is relatively new, but we are able to use existing legislation to deal with what we've required to do. The second thing we're doing, Madam President, and you can't do much about arguing this point. In order to comply, we are cross-referencing certain things. And in Clause 2B of the bill, Clause 3B of the bill, and Clause 4B of the bill, we are deleting some words and we are inserting some words. And in particular, we are inserting the reference to the Economic Sanctions Act or orders made thereunder as they relate to proliferation financing. And I'm happy Senator Vieira raised that issue of the Joint Select Committee, because when Senator Mark was talking about parliamentary oversight, I felt that this was, in fact, if he wanted and was strong on oversight, he could achieve oversight of all of this by simply agreeing to the amendment by reference to the Economic Sanctions Act, which ensures that inclusion of the reference brings the Joint Select Committee into play if we want oversight. So I thought it made sense, and I'm sure if he had another few minutes to speak, he would have gotten to that point. We're also deleting some words and substituting those words, and I will not read what they are, in 2B2 and 2B3, and it is repeated through the Act. And Madam President, as the Attorney General pointed out, because of the need to comply with the requirements of other draftspeople and the style which is required, we have to spell out the reference to the regulations and the orders made under primary legislation. But Madam President, this piece of work represents continuing work that Trinidad and Tobago has undertaken. And if I have to put this bill in context, I just want to make this point. The point is that when we went through the third round review, if you look at the report from May 2007, you will be quite surprised. In 2007, the report says that Trinidad and Tobago has no law relating to participation in an organized group, no law relating to racketeering, no law relating to terrorism or terrorist financing, no law relating to trafficking in human beings, no law relating to migrant smuggling, no law relating to piracy, no law relating to civil forfeiture. The report says there are no casinos, and there are no casinos, but private members' clubs operate like casinos. There's no real supervision over private member clubs and gaming houses. There are no AML-CFT guidelines with regard to private member clubs. The real estate business industry is not regulated. There's no mechanism in place to supervise NPOs. And of course, there's no reference to proliferation. But Madam President, over a period of time, we've been able to deal with much of what was not found in our law in 2007. And we have gone through periods where we are catching up, and we've gone through periods like we have gone through from 16 to 19, 2016 to 19, where the AG and his team from the Attorney General's office and the CPC have done tremendous work in ensuring that Trinidad and Tobago finally catches up with what we're supposed to be doing. So if you go back to this list that I have just read out from the 2007 report, and I would leave it to somebody else if they want the opportunity to use up some time. But if you go back, you start to see how we've been building, and not alone we've been building it, all of us have been building it out. And I am particularly happy, Madam President, with the way we've gone and the direction that we've headed and the extent to which, and I'm really hoping that the AG and his team bring some excellent news for us in terms of the recent review. But I want to say, Madam President, as I close, I want to say that I am particularly anxious now, given the fervor of the opposition, because I imagine that anytime soon this gambling control bill will come back to this Parliament, and I know that all of you have been reading the various reports, the reports from the 4 rounds. You've been reading all the follow-up reports, and you know that the FATF has always flagged this issue of private members' club operating as casinos with absolutely no supervision in this country. And I'm sure that you are looking forward, just as you are going to join with us tonight, you are looking forward to join with us so that we could finally regulate gambling in this country and comply with the FATF. And I'm sure you're looking forward, because that bill has already been laid. The TTRA legislation, I'm sure that you are anxious to help us comply with the FATF by having a modern regulatory agency for dealing with this matter of collection and administration of taxes. And Madam President, I thank you very much.
Senator Obika.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to begin on a point that the Minister of Agriculture raised regarding the non-profit organizations. But I want to, and the Attorney General in another place mentioned that FATF asked about the condemnation of NPO, of the NPO bill and so on. But what I'm sure the AG and the Minister of Agriculture would remember is that the non-profit organizations, protested because they were not brought into the consultative process.
Okay, so I am so sorry, Senator Obika, because this is your first sentence of your presentation, but I just don't want us, even though mention has been made of it, I don't want us going back to debates that we have held already, okay? I just want to, don't start a re-debate an issue that has been decided already in this chamber.
Thank you, Madam President. The Attorney General is on record as saying that the opposition opposes. He went at length speaking about that issue and that what he had to confront when he went to FATF and so on. However, what this government needs to be reminded of is that we would support law that is responsible and that is good and appropriate. Now, Madam President, Clause 2 of the bill contemplates, or actually makes it clear, regarding monitoring of proliferation financing. And it indicates that the central bank is to be instrumental in that process. But before I get to the financial institutions and their subjection to being targeted financial institutions based on the sanctions of FATF, I want to just to bring a point that the Attorney General spent at length in his presentation. And that has to do with the fourth-round mutual evaluation brouhaha. Now, the Attorney General boasted from pillar to post that he headed CFATF and represented the Caribbean in his capacity as a senior official in CFATF, and he extolled his own virtues as the only technical AG that went before FATF. Fishermen never say fish rotten, pardon the colloquial expression. But I'm not sure if it applies there fully. But the issue is this. The Attorney General must understand that with every position, work is required. So you can't boast of being the head honcho, but you are afraid to do the work that the position calls for. So that is the big issue. The Attorney General needs to stop loudly boasting and actually just get down to doing the work, because you don't want to bring the next cliche about empty vessels and make reference to the AG. Now, Madam President, as a result of this failure by the Honorable Attorney General and the regime to do the work on this process of, that is outlined based on Financial Action Task Force requirements, money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, anti-money laundering procedures in the financial services sector, and what have you, TNT was placed in a CFATF regime called enhanced follow-up. And I will get to what that is when I deal with the FATF, the targeted, what happens with financial institutions that are targeted for sanctioning. And the second thing is FATF International Cooperation Review Group listed Trinidad and Tobago as having strategic deficiencies in anti-money laundering and terrorist financing laws. Now, what is the reason for this? The reason for this, Madam President, is what I could simply call political grandstanding, brinkmanship. You bring legislation with aspects that could only be seen as problematic. Toxic would be another word, but I would stop at problematic. And you bring it at the very last minute. You bring it where you did not hold consultations on the difficult parts, the difficult clauses of the legislation, and you expect to run it through the parliamentary process. Now, that is what I call political brinkmanship, legislative disorder. As a result of that, the regime, the agenda that the government should have followed from the FATF recommendations and the CFATF program of action could not have materialized. So the failure is on the head of the Honorable Attorney General. And the filibustering, Madam President, even on this bill, was seen only recently, Monday. So I don't need to go into that and what happened there. I was about to go into FATF recommendation 7, but Senator Mark went at length on that. And I have no intention to detain this House further, but I want to just make a reference to FATF guidance on counter-proliferation financing, the implementation of financial provisions of United Nations Security Council resolutions to counter the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, which is pertinent to this bill, as in clause 2, as well as, well, even when you go further down in clause 2, it speaks about insertion would empower the Commission to issue warning to registrant where they breached a particular act, being the Anti-Terrorism Act. Now, when we turn to this Annex B of the document I just referenced from FATF, it spells out a few things which I want to contribute for the discourse in this debate, albeit a short debate. And I quote, "When implementing recommendation 7, competent authorities may wish to consider other regulatory measures within their legal framework to prevent asset flight and overall risks on financial and payment systems and protect the position of counterparties acting in good faith." So that's the point I want to develop on. Counterparties acting in good faith. And let me just go further. There's another paragraph, but to summarize it, it says that there's an issue regarding the protection for third parties from the extent of sanctions. And a simple example, although not referenced in the document, but a simple example, Madam President, would be money transfer companies. Because if, as the Attorney General said, there are 400 persons, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, or persons, whether they be or not be citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, who were flagged in terms of engaging in terrorism or terrorist financing, and they use a money laundering mechanism, a money transfer company to send their monies, whether it be to ISIL or what have you, there's a risk of those institutions and the persons connected to those institutions being subject to sanctions. And it will be incumbent on the government to look at that. And the last point I want to end on, Madam President, I will quote this paragraph and this sentence, and I will end on this point. Quote, this has to do with application of targeted financial sanctions. They must, quote, determine whether the designated financial institution has a presence in their country. A financial institution may have a presence by being constituted within that country because it has a branch there or because it owns or controls an entity in the country. So we should have featured, Madam President, in terms of the innocent parties that are engaged, not to their knowing, in the global supply chain of terrorist financing. There should be some mechanism where central bank reports to policymakers, at least, if the information is too sensitive, and the information that could be broadcasted to the national community. So in summary, Madam President, I want to say that today should be the last day. As a nation, we are subjected to the Honorable Attorney General, 4 years in his office, having boasted of being the head of CFATIF, taking the praise of the position and not holding himself accountable to do the work that is required. Today should be the last day that we hear the Honorable Attorney General blaming the last administration for his failure. And I want to recommend that the central bank, as referenced here, should include in their reportage to policymakers for details that are specific and that could be injurious to national security concerns, and in summary, to the wider public in their publication, so that we can be beneficiaries of information that flows from where we are in respect of the proliferation financing in terms of terrorist financing. I thank you.
Well, no, Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I am grateful. Madam President, I promise not to be short. I'll be short. But Madam President, thank you. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to contribute on this bill. Now, Madam President, the bill, it may seem very simple on the face of it, but it's not. And the reason I say that, Madam President, is because when I had the opportunity to examine the debate at the end, on Monday, with respect to this debate, and the other place, there were several government speakers, Madam President, and they would have raised several issues of pertinent public importance with respect to the clauses in this bill. Because when we speak about proliferation of financing for purposes of terrorism, we speak about preventing, Madam President, weapons of mass destruction being able to be built and utilized to destroy the peace and order and governance of any society and country. Now, while we may not have any instances in Trinidad and Tobago of the manufacture of these weapons, we have a very robust economy, and monies can be transmitted from one jurisdiction to the other in order for the financing of terrorism and the financing of the proliferation of weapons. And this bill and the model that FATF would have adopted was one in which it must be criminalized in almost all jurisdictions that they have coverage over. And in particular, Trinidad and Tobago, we have come under scrutiny in terms of the world by the Financial Action Task Force and also the Global Forum that deals with matters of terrorism and anti-money laundering. Especially, Madam President, that we have been placed on the grey list. And we have known this because there was a 2016 mutual evaluation report on Trinidad and Tobago. And this particular bill would have been touching and concerning Recommendation 7 in particular. And Senator Mark had raised it that it was since 2016 that as a country and as a government, they knew that we were deficient with respect to our laws when it comes to the proliferation of financing for weapons and terrorism. So 2016 we had notice, but we come in 2019 in order to pass the legislation. So,
I know that you have said that you're going to be brief, but you are rehashing what has been said before. So you can make your other points without going back into what has been said before.
Madam President, I thought I was going to have a record today that you wouldn't stop me, but I guess I'll try another day. And I'll try another day. And Madam President, I looked in the brief time that I had to do the research. There were papers that were produced by FATF, and there were various options they would have given various jurisdictions in order to enact the legislation. And the Attorney General chose one of the easier methods, and I pour no scorn or criticism on this method, because we must make laws as simple as possible for the ordinary man to know. And that is one of the requirements that FATF has. Because what they say, Madam President, when you deal with offenses relating to proliferation of financing, which this bill does, is create offenses. They said that a person, or this country, must make their, the persons under the regulation aware of what would amount to proliferation. And I think that is very important, because you have such a robust regulatory framework in terms of attorneys at law, real estate agents, insurance brokers, all now falling under the watch of the FIU and the FATF requirements, that these persons must now be aware. Because when transactions are made, Madam President, the ordinary man on the street needs to know whether or not a transaction that he is going to be engaged in will not amount to proliferation of financing for weapons. Because these things carry very serious and severe consequences. And I think that the government don't just pass the legislation because FATF told us to pass it. Pass it because you want to also make Trinidad and Tobago a better place. Pass it so that the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago understand their sanctions, their responsibilities, and their obligations under all of this framework. Because as an attorney at law, Madam President, I myself sometimes I'm so confused with the amount of regulations that are now being placed upon us. So the ordinary man in the street obviously will have some difficulty in digesting all of these FATF requirements. And I think it's especially important because of how rapidly we pass these legislation in this particular parliament. And I want to go with respect to the Attorney General's comment when he speaks about mutual evaluation and Trinidad and Tobago re-rating. Now, when FATF decides to evaluate a particular jurisdiction, they do so and they examine two things, Madam President. The first thing is effectiveness, and the second thing is technical compliance. Now, the Attorney General boasted, and I know many speakers said it, that he's the most technical Attorney General. But, Madam President, FATF would not leave us there. They will look at the effectiveness, because we pass all of the laws. We pass all of the laws. And I know you are listening attentively, so you would have moved the mic so that you can have the benefit of the entire presentation. I thought I was going to be stopped. But, Madam President, no. The effectiveness must also be evaluated. Because when you pass a law, you don't just pass it for the purposes of getting off a list. You pass the law so that it works. That it works not just for the government, but for the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And with these pieces of particular legislation, it benefits the entire world. Because while we may not be subject to any terrorist activity or terrorists, we may have terrorist threats in the past, Madam President, at least we can say we are lucky that it's not on such a scale as other places around the world where lives have been lost due to bombings and radicals shootings and the hijacking of planes, Madam President. And these are very pertinent issues because at the end of the day, in order to stem terrorism and the fight against terrorism, we must cut their lifeline. And what is that lifeline? It is financing. It is money. Money is required for terrorists to function, and therefore we must, as a country, ensure that we don't participate in financing terrorism in any part of the world, and especially in Trinidad and Tobago. And this bill also will touch and concern the Anti-Terrorism Act. And FATF had a lot of good things to say also when they examined our recommendation 7 compliance back in 2016. And they would have said that notwithstanding you don't have laws to deal with proliferation of weapons, when you look at the Anti-Terrorism Act, in particular, sections 22B and 22AA, they're listing elements, and this is the old act that I'll be quoting because we would have recently amended the Anti-Terrorism Act. And they said that there have been provisions for the seizing of assets and the listing of terrorists. So that is a good thing, so that we are not completely not compliant with FATF. We have reached somewhere, and we are continuing to go somewhere. And I'm happy, as a patriot of Trinidad and Tobago, to know that the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago can come here and say that we stand a very good chance at getting a good report at the end of the day. I am very happy for that. But as Senator Obika said, that the Attorney General cannot take the credit for it. It was a parliament as a whole. Every single sitting member of this parliament would have contributed to Trinidad and Tobago finding its place on a better rating on FATF, Madam President. And I think as a parliament, we must commend ourselves for that. Another issue the Attorney General raised was the listings of the terrorist organizations, the terrorist entities. And I'm happy to know that Trinidad and Tobago list so many individuals. They list so many entities. But, Madam President, when you look behind this, because you'll see it in the newspaper ever so often, there's an order made by the court with respect to a certain entity being listed. I believe even Osama bin Laden's son was listed as a terrorist in Trinidad and Tobago. But what is the effectiveness of that, Madam President? The effectiveness is that we only list. But at the end of the day, Trinidad and Tobago, they have no assets here, because when you read the order also makes an order that the person's assets are seized in Trinidad and Tobago. So it's really an empty order which is being made with respect to the listings under the Anti-Terrorism Act. It's really a rubber stamping exercise, because when the United Nations Security Council lists someone, it's an automatic listing right here in Trinidad and Tobago. And I promised that I would not be very long. That was a joke. Yeah. You don't understand the jokes, right? But, Madam President, the Attorney General spoke of flip-flopping. He spoke of flip-flopping, that one day we support, one day we don't support. But I think the Attorney General is also guilty of flip-flopping, because if I can remember, it was the same Attorney General, the Honorable Faris Al-Rawi, who would have commended Senator Saddam Hosein on the good work at the Joint Select Committee of the Anti-Terrorism Act. And yes.
Are you going to say, right now, I thank you, because you are straying very, very, very far?
Oh, Madam President, I thought I would have been stopped once, but it was twice. But I am going to end. I was just rebutting the Attorney General, but I must also congratulate Senator Sophia Choate, who also worked diligently with us on that JSC, and all other members of the Parliament. And I thank you very much, Madam President, for having this opportunity to ensure that we have good law and that we are able to put ourselves on a better place on the international scale. And I thank you.
Attorney General.
Madam President, I thank honourable members for their contributions. I also wish to thank Senator Rambharat in particular for effectively giving a comprehensive reply to many of the issues on the table. I wish, in relation to this bill, because this bill does attach on to the statements that Senator Hussain was just making on the anti-terrorism bill, it's a matter of fact, Senator Hussain, that I did certainly compliment him for the work done in the Joint Select Committee. Unfortunately, that fell apart when we came to the House, and that's where the about-face happened. So we need to be careful with precise aspects of it. Great work in committee. Don't come and then take it back in the House and say you don't agree with your own report, because that's what that was about. Madam President, this bill is important, it's proportional, it's measured, there's been fulsome advocacy in piloting the legislation. Senator Rambharat has given excellent response. I beg to move.
Honorable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act number 4 of 2018 be now read a second time. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act Number 4 of 2018.
Attorney General.
Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 66-1, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act Number 4 of 2018 be committed to a committee of the whole Senate forthwith to be considered clause by clause.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act Number 4 of 2018 be committed to a committee of the whole Senate forthwith to be considered clause by clause. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The Senate shall now go into committee of the whole to consider the bill clause by clause. Yeah.
Clauses 1 to 4.
Honourable Senators, the question is that clauses 1 to 4 stand part of the bill. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The question is that clauses 1 to 4 now stand part of the bill. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. Clauses 1 to 4 now stand part of the bill. Honourable Senators, the question is that the bill be now reported to the Senate. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The bill will now be reported to the Senate. Attorney General.
Yes, Madam President. Madam President, I wish to report that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act Number 4 of 2018 was considered in Committee of the Whole and approved without amendments. I now beg to move that the Senate agree with the committee's report.
Honourable Senators, the question is that this Senate agree with the committee's report on a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act Number 4 of 2018. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Attorney General.
Madam President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act Number 4 of 2018 be read a third time and passed.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act Number 4 of 2018 be now read a third time and passed. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act Number 4 of 2018.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, before I move the adjournment, When I came into the Senate this afternoon, somebody told me I was looking tired. So thank you for an early night. Madam President, I beg to move that this Senate do now adjourn to Monday, the 17th of June, 2019 at 10 a.m. We'll be doing the miscellaneous provision that will be debated in the House on Friday. It deals with tax amnesty, freedom of information, etc. And pensions, yeah. At 10 o'clock, Monday.
Tuesday it has to go to the House.
Thursday goes to the House.
And there's a tax amnesty, that's why.
This is a deadline for the tax amnesty.
Sorry? Yeah. Honorable Senators, I had approved 2 matters on the adjournment, but I am not seeing Senator Mark. So the question is that the Senate do now adjourn to Monday, June the 17th, 2019 at 10 a.m. Those in favor, no. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. This Senate is now adjourned to Monday, June the 17th, 2019 at 10 a.m.